For a while, I had this routine. Every morning, I would walk to the same convenience store for coffee. I would pass by the same park. I would see the same cashier, and we would share the same quiet nod as though we knew something about one another. And then my girlfriend at the time left me for somebody else, and she had the nerve to continue living nearby. And so suddenly, this convenience store was no longer neutral territory. It felt like a potential ambush site. And so I started calculating the odds. I mean, what are the chances? We got different schedules, we got different lives, and who cares anyway? And after 2 weeks or so of avoiding it, I told myself, I can't let this take my freedom. Which felt like a really heroic thing to say about getting coffee. And so I went, and I walked in, and a moment later, so did she, along with her upgraded relationship. I saw them before they saw me, which is always worse, because now I have to do this impression of somebody who noticed nothing and is completely unbothered. And so I did, and I got my coffee, and I decided, you know what, I'm just going to go to a new convenience store, and I actually don't even like that part of town. I figured problem solved. And then a few months later, I was hanging out with a friend of mine who actually worked in that part of town. And he got a phone call and let me know that he had to run by the shop real quick and asked me if I wanted to tag along. And I hesitated for a second, but I thought, what are the odds? So I went and I stood outside waiting while he ran in, and I look up and there she is. And I just thought, you've got to be kidding me. And she smiled and walked by and said, hey. And I didn't say anything. Instead, my nervous system gave me this uncontrollable twitch in my cheek. And thank God this happened during COVID because I was wearing this sunglasses mask combo that hid the whole thing. So my dignity was preserved by public health policy. But standing there, half glitching under my sunglasses, I realized that I wasn't just avoiding a convenience store or a side of town. I was rearranging whole routines to avoid being noticed while struggling. I went to 7 schools before the 7th grade, mostly in the same state with the same kind of curriculum, seeming like the same general place. But the differences between them were kind of dramatic. And at one school, I was too quiet, and at another, I was kind of annoying. And kids like you at some, and then they don't like you at others. So I learned quickly, without being able to really put it into words, that culture is contextual, and so is identity. Every time I moved, I tried to take what I learned from the previous school and apply it to the next one. It was my own private study in social acceptance. I tried to figure out what was cool and what was funny, and can I still spike my hair? You'd think I was conducting sociological research, but in reality I was just trying not to seem weird. And being the new kid had its disadvantages, but it also had one major advantage, which was that nobody knew me, so they didn't know what I was supposed to be. And I liked that. I liked feeling possible. At a new school, I could role play somebody with confidence, and sometimes it worked long enough to even convince me. No one knew my history long enough to argue with it, and it felt really freeing. If something didn't work socially or emotionally or relationally, there was always the possibility of a reset at the next school. And at some point along the way, I developed this belief that rooting limits growth, and that staying is somehow stopping. If you hang around long enough, people build this fixed idea of you, and they resist you stepping outside of that. And so you change at the risk of every 6th grader noticing it right away and announcing it to everybody in the cafeteria loudly. But if you move, you get a do-over. So movement preserves optionality. As I got older, moving was no longer something that just happened to me. Instead, it became a strategic choice. If I went through a breakup, good, I'll just go somewhere new. And if a friendship got weird, I would just create distance. Even if I was just bored, and just find new scenery. It didn't feel dramatic or wrong. It actually felt pretty efficient and exciting. It felt like I was preserving my own ability to evolve and grow. But if I'm honest, sometimes I wasn't protecting growth. I was preserving when and where I could be seen. If I left, no one got to watch the awkward, bumbling, figuring it out stages. No one held me to the version that didn't land the joke, or didn't get chosen, or twitched weirdly outside of a convenience store. I couldn't be misread if I was gone. For a time, I worked in a nursing home in New Jersey, and there were residents there that told me they had never even left their county. And at first, that sounded awful to me, but then I noticed that they had things that I couldn't even imagine. They had lifelong friends since childhood. I felt like you could point at any location and they could unpack some story about a phase in their life that occurred there. And they had really strong opinions about the best place to get a hoagie. They didn't just know each other, they watched each other change. They had seen the awkward phases of one another. They had been there through failed marriages and bad decisions, and they were still there. It wasn't smallness, it was accumulation. Movement had given me endless novelty and range, but it gave them this compounded kind of depth. So at 26, I decided I was going to stay in one place. Not because I had to, but I was just curious about what would happen if I stopped treating discomfort like a relocation queue. Relationships would fall apart, and I just stayed. And that was new and really uncomfortable. And friendships would hit turbulence, and instead of just quietly disappearing, I realized that repairing was actually an option. But repair is much less cinematic than reinvention. It looks like awkward talks over coffee, and admitting fault, and letting someone see you flawed and unsure. It's slower, sometimes painfully so, but it compounds. And then I understood something that I just couldn't before. That familiarity wasn't some sort of invisible leash, and instead it was more like planting a seed and sticking around long enough to actually see what grows. I traded excitement for something I could lean on, and that also leaned back on me. I still crave newness, and I have moments of restlessness, but I've realized that I can satiate those feelings by reorganizing and redesigning the space I'm in, instead of completely abandoning it for something new. I used to equate change with growth, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe movement makes you fluid, but staying is what gives you form. I used to tell myself that I had the heart of an explorer, but now I wonder how much of my love for continuous change came from a sense of curiosity, and how much of it came from just the desire to have an escape hatch. I'm not interested in going back, but I do understand why I clung to it for as long as I did.